Christian Dior only ran Christian Dior for 10 years. 10. That is the wild part. Because this is not the story of some designer who slowly built a fashion empire over half a century, brick by brick, gala by gala, rich client by rich client. No, this is a man who appears almost out of nowhere, drops one collection that makes the fashion world lose its mind, becomes the most powerful name in couture, and then dies suddenly at the height of it all. And somehow, that is not where the story ends. Dior was born in 1905 in a seaside town on the coast of Normandy into a wealthy family that wanted absolutely nothing to do with fashion. His father made his money in fertilizer, which is already such a strange little detail for a story this glamorous. The plan for Christian was tidy, respectable, and completely wrong. Become a diplomat, wear the right suit, shake the right hands, and please, for the love of the family name, do not become involved with dresses. But Christian was not built that way. He was quiet, sensitive, superstitious to the bone. He visited fortune tellers, believed in signs, trusted luck, and seemed to move through life like the universe was always whispering clues to him. And this nervous, dreamy boy would eventually reshape how the entire world dressed. Then, right when he reached the top, he was gone. So the obvious question is, how does a fashion house survive when the man whose name is on the door disappears after only a decade? Because what happens to Dior after Dior is honestly even stranger than what happened while he was alive. And by the end of this story, you will understand why that name is still everywhere you look. Let's start with the boy who was absolutely not supposed to sew. Christian Dior grew up in a pink stucco villa in Normandy, surrounded by his mother's gardens. And if you know Dior even a little, you can already feel the foreshadowing blooming in the background. The flowers mattered. They would follow him for the rest of his life. Roses, lilies, soft petals, curved stems, that whole garden world of beauty and control. Years later, when his dresses seemed to open like flowers around a woman's body, it was not coming from nowhere. It started there, in that villa, in those gardens, with his mother. But money did not mean freedom. His father wanted a serious son with a serious career. Fashion was not serious. Fashion was decoration. Fashion was frivolous. Fashion was something a family like theirs admired from a distance, maybe, but certainly did not enter. So Christian was pushed toward political science, the diplomatic path, a proper life. And he tried, sort of, but what he loved was art, really loved it. On the side, he and a friend opened a small gallery, selling work by names that were not exactly small forever. Picasso, Dalí. Imagine that for a second. Christian Dior, before Dior, standing in a gallery with early modern art on the walls, trying to build a life that felt like his. For a brief moment, it worked. Then the floor vanished. The Great Depression hit. His family's fortune evaporated. His mother died. A brother died. The gallery folded. In just a few brutal years, the elegant, protected world Christian had known collapsed around him. No money, no clear future, no soft landing. This is the part of the story where you can almost see him standing in the rubble of his own life, wondering what was left. And what was left was not status, not comfort, not the career his father wanted. It was one small talent nobody had taken seriously, drawing. And sometimes when life strips everything else away, the thing you were never supposed to do becomes the only door still open. Christian Dior did not enter fashion through the front door. He entered it broke. Desperate for money, he started selling fashion sketches on the street. Little drawings of hats and dresses. Whatever someone would buy, he would sell. And for a man raised in comfort, raised to be polished and respectable, that must have felt like a long fall. But here is the lovely twist. He was good. Not promising if you squint. Good. Good enough that people noticed. His sketches had life in them, shape, taste. a kind of instinct. He could see a garment before it existed, and he could put that dream on paper with enough charm that someone else wanted it. Those drawings caught the attention of established designers, and before long Christian was working as an assistant for the couturier Robert Piguet. Now, this was not champagne and front rows. Not yet. This was long hours, low pay, someone else's name on the label, someone else's glory. But for Christian, it was an education. He was learning the machinery of beauty from the inside, how a garment is cut, how a silhouette is built, how one line can make a dress feel severe, romantic, young, old, rich, sad, alive. That is the magic of fashion when it is working. Tiny changes, huge consequences. And just as Christian started finding his footing, history shoved its way into the room. War broke out. France was occupied. Christian was called up for service. The life he had rebuilt, piece by tiny piece, was interrupted again. You would think this might bury him. It didn't. The strange thing about Dior is that every collapse seems to push him closer to the thing he is meant to become. The family fortune disappears, and he finds drawing. The gallery fails, and he finds fashion. War interrupts him, and somehow, out of that gray, exhausted world, he is about to produce the brightest, most extravagant fashion moment anyone had seen in years. And oh, it was a moment. After the war, France was tired in a way that is hard to picture from a runway photo. Everything was rationed. Fabric was scarce. Clothing had become boxy, severe, practical, because it had to be. Women's clothes were not whispering romance. They were saying, "We survived." And fair enough. Christian Dior, now working for the couturier Lucien Lelong, watched all of this. He saw the austerity, the hunger, the emotional flatness of a country trying to stand up again. Then came Marcel Boussac. Boussac was a wealthy textile magnate, and he offered Christian the kind of chance most designers only fantasize about: money to open a fashion house under his own name. Christian Dior. On the door, on the label, on the future. In 1947, Dior presented his first collection, and it detonated. There is no softer word for it. He brought back cinched waists, padded hips, skirts so full they swallowed yards and yards of fabric. After years of rationing and military severity, Dior put abundance back on the body. It was not subtle. That was the point. His clothes said, "The war is over, beauty is allowed back in the room. Romance is not dead. A skirt can be huge again. A waist can be tiny again. A woman can look like a flower, a belle, a fantasy." The editor of Harper's Bazaar reportedly gasped and called it a new look. The name stuck forever. Some people were furious. And honestly, you can see why. All that fabric so soon after the war? It felt extravagant, wasteful, almost rude. But most people were spellbound. Overnight, this unknown 42-year-old became the designer everyone was talking about. Not gradually, not politely, overnight. He had escaped poverty, war, grief, and obscurity, and now the entire fashion world was staring at him. But here is where success gets dangerous, because the dream he had chased for years was about to become a machine, and that machine was hungry. Almost immediately, Dior was not just a designer. Dior became an engine. The house expanded at a staggering pace. Perfume came first, including Miss Dior, named after his sister. Then licensing deals, boutiques, a foothold in America. The label stopped being a Parisian couture house and started becoming a global name. At its height, the House of Dior reportedly accounted for a huge share of all French fashion exports. Read that again in your head. That is not just fashion. That is national industry with better tailoring. And at the center of it all was Christian Dior, the shy, anxious, superstitious man who had somehow become an emperor of taste. He was not some swaggering showman who loved the heat. He was nervous. He was private. He believed in omens and luck. He consulted his personal fortune teller before major decisions. which is such a delicious detail because imagine running one of the most important fashion houses on earth and still needing the stars to sign off. But the pressure was real. Collections did not stop. Expectations did not stop. The world wanted the next line, the next shape, the next commandment from Paris. Dior kept giving it to them. The H line, the A line, silhouettes that told women around the world what fashion would look like next. Season after season, he pulled the industry behind him. That sounds glamorous until you remember there is a human being inside the myth. And Christian was wearing down. The pace was brutal. The responsibility was enormous. His name was no longer just his name. It was perfume, clothes, exports, employees, clients, expectations, money, Paris itself. Imagine that weight on a man who once just wanted to draw beautiful things. Behind the empire, a clock was ticking. No one could hear it yet, but the man who had conquered fashion in 10 short years was running out of time. In October of 1957, while on holiday in Italy, Christian Dior died of a heart attack. He was 52 years old. That sentence still feels too abrupt, which is exactly why it hit so hard. He had led his own house for only 10 years, 1 decade. In that little slice of time, he changed the silhouette of the post-war world, built a global business, turned his own name into a symbol, and made Paris feel like the capital of fashion again. Then he was gone. The fashion world was stunned. Newspapers treated it like the death of a monarch, and in a very real sense, that is what it was. The industry had been orbiting one man. Designers reacted to him. Clients chased him. Editors watched him. Buyers waited for him. And now the center was empty. This is where the story should become simple. Founder dies. House bears his name. The magic goes with him. Curtain, right? No, this is where Dior becomes something bigger and much stranger than one man's biography, because the people running the business made a decision that had not really been tested on this scale. They decided Dior would live without Dior. The name would stay, the house would continue, the ghost would remain in the room. But somebody had to take the pencil. Somebody had to stand where Christian had stood and tell the world what came next. And the person they chose was not an established master, not some grand elder of Paris couture. They chose a 21-year-old assistant, a kid. And suddenly, the future of one of the most important fashion houses in the world was placed in the hands of Yves Saint Laurent. Yves Saint Laurent was shy, young, and almost absurdly inexperienced for the job he had just been given, barely old enough to drink, and now he was expected to carry Dior. Can you imagine that pressure? Every editor, buyer, client, rival, and gossip in Paris waiting to see if this boy would save the house or embarrass it. Against all odds, his first collection was a hit. He softened Dior's rigid silhouettes into something younger and freer. The clothes still belonged to the house, but they had air in them. Movement. A little youth. For a moment it looked like Dior had found another genius, as if the name itself had somehow summoned one. Then reality came crashing in. Saint Laurent was drafted into the French army. His health and nerves collapsed under the strain. While he was away, the house replaced him. It was brutal. It was also the beginning of another legend, because Yves Saint Laurent would go on to found his own extraordinary label. But Dior needed stability. So began the long, strange work of being a house haunted by its founder. Every designer who followed had the same impossible job. Honor Christian Dior without embalming him. Keep the romance, but do not turn it into a museum. Respect the silhouette, but make people want to buy clothes now. Marc Bohan guided the house steadily for decades. Gianfranco Ferré later brought Italian grandeur. They kept Dior alive. They kept the machine moving. They protected the name, but over time, the house started drifting towards safe, respectable, and maybe a little too sleepy, which is dangerous for a brand built on a fashion explosion. Dior did not need a polite caretaker forever. It needed voltage. And in the 1990s, voltage arrived in the form of a wild British outsider who looked nothing like the quiet man who founded the house. Enter John Galliano. In 1996, Dior handed the reins to John Galliano, and if Christian Dior was the shy garden dreamer, Galliano was the theater kid who had somehow broken into the palace and found the costume closet. He was flamboyant, dramatic, a British designer known for runway shows that felt less like fashion presentations and more like fever dreams with better tailoring. Traditionalists were horrified. This man, at Dior, the sacred house of Dior? Yes. And that is exactly why it worked. Galliano understood that Dior had never really been boring. People forget that because the name became so polished, so grand, so luxury-coated. But the original new look was outrageous. It was excessive. It made people gasp. It annoyed people. It made headlines. Galliano brought back that sense of danger. He turned the runway into theater. He blended Christian's love of flowers, structure, femininity, and fantasy with a boldness the brand had not felt in decades. The shows became events. The clothes became conversation. Sales soared. Dior was thrilling again. For over a decade, Galliano was the beating heart of the house. Then it all collapsed. In 2011, he was caught on video making vile anti-Semitic remarks. The fallout was immediate. Dior fired him within days. And just like that, the most electric house in Paris was publicly leaderless. This was not a quiet transition. It was a crisis, a reputational wound, a creative vacuum. The brand that had been built on spectacle now had to find dignity again. But Dior has this strange pattern, doesn't it? Collapse, reinvention, collapse, reinvention. Out of the scandal, the house would steady itself, and eventually it would make a choice that would have been unthinkable in Christian Dior's own era. After a rocky interim period, Dior brought in Raf Simons, and what a tonal shift. After Galliano's drama, Simons arrived with a quieter, sharper, more modern eye. He was a Belgian minimalist, and he stripped back the noise without stripping away the soul. Clean lines, flowers, structure. A conversation with Christian Dior's original codes, but spoken in a cooler voice. His time at the house became so celebrated, it was captured in an entire documentary. He did not stay long, but he did something important. He steadied the ship. Then, in 2016, Dior made history inside its own walls. For the first time ever, the house appointed a woman as creative director, Maria Grazia Chiuri. Think about that. A fashion house built largely around dressing women, founded in 1947, did not have a female creative director until 2016. Chiuri walked into a legacy full of ghosts, Christian's flowers, Saint Laurent's youth, Galliano's spectacle, Simon's restraint. And people wondered whether she could carry it. She answered by making Dior speak to a new generation. Her runway became more direct, more message-driven, more openly connected to the world outside the salon. She put bold, unapologetic statements into the clothes and the shows, and she grounded Dior's romance in something current, something political, something real. Not everyone agreed with every choice. That is fashion. If everyone nods politely, something has probably gone wrong. But commercially, Dior surged. Under Chiuri, the house did not merely survive. It became one of the most dominant luxury brands on earth, worth billions. And that is where the story gets almost absurd in the best way. The shy boy who once sold little sketches on the street just to eat became, decades after his death, the name on a global empire that keeps growing. And still, if you look closely, Christian is everywhere. In the flowers, in the waist, in the drama of the silhouette, in the idea that fashion can arrive like a thunderclap and change the air in the room. Step back and look at the full shape of this thing. A superstitious kid from Normandy is born into a family that wants him nowhere near fashion. He grows up among flowers, gets pushed toward diplomacy, tries to make a life in art, loses his fortune, loses his family, loses the gallery, and ends up selling sketches on the street to survive. That alone would be a life. But then he claws his way into couture, learns the craft, survives war, gets one impossible chance from Marcel Boussac. And in one afternoon in 1947, he rewrites the rules of how the world dresses. One afternoon. Then he builds an empire in 10 years. Perfume, boutiques, licensing, America, exports, silhouettes that make women everywhere look different. And then he dies at 52. Gone. All that is left is a name. But the name refuses to behave like a memorial. It keeps moving. It passes to a nervous 21-year-old genius, then to a steady craftsman, then to Italian grandeur, then to a theatrical showman who wakes the house up and flies too close to the sun, then to a quiet minimalist who cools the room down, then to the first woman ever trusted to lead Dior. Each era could have broken it. Some nearly did. And somehow, each one gave the house another life. Today, Dior is one of the most valuable fashion names on the planet. And every time a model walks out with a cinched waist, a full skirt, a flower motif, a sense of romance sharpened into architecture, there he is, Christian Dior. A man who has been dead for nearly 70 years, still leaving fingerprints on the runway. That is the part I cannot get over. He only had a decade, and somehow he is still winning. So that is the story of Christian Dior, a man who turned personal ruin into the most influential fashion debut of the 20th century, then left behind a name powerful enough to outlive him, outgrow him, and keep reinventing itself without losing his shadow. And that, to me, is what makes Dior so fascinating. It is not just beautiful clothes. It is a ghost story with tailoring, a legacy story, a question that keeps being answered by different people in different decades. What does Dior mean when Dior himself is gone? Maybe that is why the house still works. It is never only looking backward, but it never fully escapes him either. The garden is still there. The waist is still there. The drama is still there. Christian Dior built a world in 10 years, and everyone after him has been trying to live inside it, renovate it, and keep the lights on. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit like, drop a comment with the designer you want me to cover next, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next story.